Blue Ridge Foothills, Western Virginia, autumn 1879. The leaves had already turned copper and rust when Callum Rainey began hauling sandstone blocks up the hillside to his half-finished cabin. His neighbors watched from their porches, curious at first, then confused. The Scottish blacksmith wasn't building an ordinary chimney. He was building something no one in Patrick County had ever seen. At the center of his masonry work sat a 40-gallon cast-iron tank, the kind normally used for rendering lard or boiling laundry. Rainey had paid 3 months' wages to have it shipped from a foundry in Richmond. Now he was embedding it directly into the stonework 18 inches above where his firebox would sit. "A chimney ain't a cookpot," muttered Samuel Dawes, a tobacco farmer who lived a quarter-mile down the creek. His wife laughed. Others shook their heads. By the time Rainey finished mortaring the first course, half the settlement had already decided he'd lost his mind. But Callum Rainey wasn't building a cookpot. He was building a machine, one designed to capture heat that every other chimney in Virginia was throwing away. What did this immigrant tradesman understand about wasted energy that his American neighbors had never stopped to consider? If you've ever wondered how pioneers stretched every BTU from a single fire, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Leave a comment telling us what's the smartest heating trick you've ever seen. And if this story surprises you, give it a like. It helps more people discover forgotten wisdom. Callum Rainey was born in 1841 in Inverness in the Scottish Highlands to a family that worked stone and iron through 5 generations of brutal winters. His father built hearths, his uncle forged tools. By the age of 14, Callum had learned both trades, and more importantly, he had learned to feel heat the way a musician feels rhythm. He immigrated to America in 1866, following the promise of cheap land and plentiful timber. He settled in the Blue Ridge foothills, where he set up a small forge and earned his living shoeing horses, mending plows, and fabricating hinges for barn doors. It was honest work, but every winter the same observation haunted him. Heat was being wasted constantly, universally, and completely without awareness. He watched his neighbors stack oak and hickory beside their hearths, burning cord after cord through December, January, February. He watched the smoke rise from their chimneys, carrying temperatures of 400, 500, sometimes 600 degrees Fahrenheit straight into the frozen sky. And he watched those same families haul kettles to separate fires just to boil water for washing, bathing, and scalding milk pails. 2 fires, double the labor, double the fuel. For what? Rainey understood something that blacksmithing had taught him through years of burns, blisters, and trial. Heat moved. It conducted through iron. It radiated from stone. It rose through and escaped through any gap it could find. And most critically, it could be stored. A 100-pound anvil, once heated, stayed warm for hours. A bed of fire bricks held enough energy to keep a forge workable long after the coals died. Mass absorbed heat. Mass released heat. This was not theory. This was something Rainey had felt with his own hands 1,000 times. So why, he wondered, did every chimney in America treat flue gases like garbage? His concept was simple in principle, radical in execution. Embed a sealed cast-iron water reservoir directly into the chimney mass, positioned in the path of rising flue gases. The fire would heat the air would heat the stone and gases would heat the water, and the water, all 40 gallons of it, would become a thermal battery, storing energy that would otherwise vanish into the winter sky. Hot water on demand, no separate fire, no extra wood, just captured heat doing double duty. He spent the summer of 1879 designing the system in charcoal sketches on pine boards. He calculated the tank's position 18 inches above the firebox throat, surrounded by 2 inches of fire brick on all sides, then 12 inches of dense sandstone. He planned for a gravity-fed cold water inlet from a barrel outside the cabin's north wall. Cold water flowed down through a 1/4-inch copper line, entered the tank at its lowest point, and as it heated, rose naturally through the system. The hot water outlet, positioned at the tank's highest point, ran through the interior wall and terminated at a brass spigot above Rainey's wash basin. No pumps, no valves, just physics. On the evening of October 24th, Rainey lit the first fire. He used seasoned oak, dense, slow burning, and hot. The firebox caught quickly, and within 30 minutes, the stones around the hearth were warm to the touch. He placed his hand on the chimney mass at chest height, near where the tank was embedded. Cool at first, then gradually, faintly warm. At 90 minutes, he opened the spigot. The water that flowed out was not boiling, but it was hot enough that he pulled his hand back instinctively. He estimated the temperature at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, perhaps slightly higher. Warm enough to wash, warm enough to prove the concept. By 8 o'clock that evening, with the fire burned down to coals, the spigot water had reached 145 degrees. He filled a basin, added a measure of cold water to make it tolerable, and washed his face and arms with soap for the first time in weeks without hauling a kettle. The fire consumed no more wood than any ordinary hearth, but now it delivered 2 services instead of 1. Rainey refilled the gravity barrel the next morning and repeated the process. By noon, with a moderate fire burning, the system held steady. By evening, the water temperature had stabilized at 150 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to scald if he wasn't careful. He mentioned the results to Samuel Dawes, who had stopped by to return a borrowed chisel. Dawes listened, shrugged, and said, "One warm night doesn't make a winter. Let's see how it holds when the real cold comes." Rainey didn't argue. He simply nodded and added another log to the fire. If you're learning something new about how pioneers engineered heat, subscribe and hit the bell. There's more coming. Drop a comment below. Would you trust this system in your cabin? The real cold came on January 14, 1880. A mass of Arctic air descended from Canada, swept across the Ohio Valley, and settled into the Appalachian hollows with the weight of iron. By dawn, the temperature at the Rainey cabin had fallen to 7 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The creek froze solid by midday. Livestock huddled in barns, their breath crystallizing on the walls. Men who ventured outside returned with frost on their beards and numbness in their fingers. For the settlers of Patrick County, this was survival weather, the kind that tested every joint in every cabin, every cord of stacked wood, every decision made in the warmer months. At the Elias Compton cabin, a quarter-mile south, the family burned oak through the night and woke to an interior temperature of 48 degrees. Elias Compton estimated he had used nearly a third more wood than usual. His wife boiled water for washing on a separate hearth fire, consuming additional fuel. By the second day of the cold snap, he sent his eldest son to the woodpile 3 times. At the Pewitt cabin, the story was similar. Margaret Pewitt kept her fire roaring from dusk to dawn, but the cabin's thin chinking and single-layer walls bled heat faster than she could produce it. She slept in her coat. Her washing water froze in the basin overnight. At the Rainey cabin, the morning of January 15th arrived differently. Callum Rainey woke at 6 a.m. to a cabin interior of 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire had burned down to embers hours earlier, but the chimney mass, all 5,000 pounds of stone, mortar, fire brick, and water, was still radiating heat into the room. He placed his hand on the hearthstones. Warm. He touched the chimney wall at shoulder height. Warm. He opened the spigot above the wash basin. The water flowed at 130 degrees. He relit the fire with a small charge of kindling and 2 splits of oak. Within an hour, the cabin had climbed to 66 degrees. The water temperature rose to 145. By the end of the 3-day cold snap, Rainey had burned approximately the same quantity of wood as a normal January week. His neighbors had burned 30 to 40% more, and not one of them had enjoyed hot water without lighting a second fire. Elias Compton visited on January 18th, after the temperatures had moderated. He did not announce his purpose. He simply walked into Rainey's cabin, looked at the chimney, and placed his palm against the stonework. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. The fire had been out for 5 hours. The stone was still warm. Compton said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked, "Do you still have those drawings?" Rainey did. He had kept them on a pine board above his workbench. By February, 4 families had approached him about building similar systems. By the following winter, local accounts suggest that at least 11 cabins within a 50-mile radius of Rainey's original homestead had incorporated some version of his design. The variations were telling. They revealed not blind copying, but intelligent modification, the kind that happens when an idea meets local materials, local needs, and local ingenuity. In Floyd County, a farmer named Jacob Keller built a version using soapstone instead of sandstone. Soapstone, softer and easier to carve, had a thermal conductivity nearly identical to sandstone, but could be shaped with hand tools. Keller's chimney mass weighed slightly less, approximately 4,000 pounds, but retained heat just as effectively. His water tank was smaller, only